Think of a mountain, tall and serene, powerful and majestic. If you can think of grandfathers sitting on the banks of its lakes and its streams and telling stories to the young. The simple majesty of singing birds and graceful deer and elk. A place of spirit, a place of peace, a place of awesome beauty. Of the sunlight playing on its snow-capped top and dancing through the pristine waters of the lake. There was the hush of a forest morning, the serenity of a temple to the wild. Even its name suggested majesty and peace and serenity. Mount St. Helens, May 18th, 1980.
You might think in terms of the Armageddon.
It's 9:17 at KOZI Isenhart, and we have this news bulletin for you. Apparently, Mount St. Helens has gone into a state of extreme eruption. The U.S. Forest Service has reported a big eruption on the mountain today. A huge cloud, they say, is visible over the reawakened volcano. And Forest Service spokesman Jim Unterwegener said that no other details are immediately available. Radio Lake Chelan's attempts to call our news sources at the volcano and elsewhere in southwestern Washington have been futile in the past few minutes. The long-distance phone lines apparently all over the state are just all tied up, but we will try to get more information when it becomes available. Of course, the major fear for such an eruption has been the large bulge area reported on the north face of that mountain that's been bulging out at the rate of about 5 feet per day. And there has been fear that in the event of an eruption, that large bulged area would go careening down the side of the mountain at speeds in excess of 100 miles per hour, wipe out Spirit Lake and on down into the Toutle River, and perhaps even wiping out the community of Toutle. But we do not know if that has happened at this point. We have no information at all except that there is a very large eruption of Mount St. Helens going on. We had phone calls this morning, somewhere between 8:30 and 9 o'clock, indicating that folks here had heard a boom of some type, an explosion, and had also felt a tremor. At this point, we do not know if that was related to Mount St. Helens or not. It is a long ways away, but I suppose it would be possible. Scott Brundage for Radio Lake Chelan will have more details as they're available. I am Scott Brundage. I work at KOZI Radio at Lake Chelan, Washington, a couple of 100 miles from the volcano. It was painfully obvious from the very beginning that morning that distance and the nature of the eruption itself would deprive us of information on the scope of that blast for at least some time. And often what information we did get was inadequate. What you are listening to now is not a definitive documentary on the eruption or its aftermath. At our time of production, such an analysis would be impossible. There is still so much that is unknown, and there's no certainty that the mountain has even finished with its fireworks. What this tape is, then, is a recreation of the first hours of the events of May 18th, as we were able to cover them at the time. You have already heard our first bulletin from that day. It is our record, this tape is, our recollection of the first hours of covering the effects of an unimaginably gigantic explosion. At 8:32 a.m., a geologist on Mount St. Helens, about 8 miles down its north slope, radioed, "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it." He was Dave Johnston, and he was never heard from again. An explosion which moved approximately 3/4 of a cubic mile of earth was taking place. An area between 10 and 15 miles down the north slope was being annihilated by a blast concussion equaling at least 1,600 miles per hour of wind. In seconds, the mountain had shrouded itself in secrecy. A 60,000-foot plume of ash and debris bellowed from its cone, and its ash darkened the entire area. It was as though Mount St. Helens desired privacy for her first major activity in 123 years. She pulled a curtain over herself and left the outside world with no knowledge whatever. A spokesman for the U.S. Geological Survey was heard on ABC Radio News.
All we know at this point is that there has been an eruption. It was accompanied by a fairly sizable earthquake. The column has been reported to be over 50,000 feet, perhaps up to 60,000 feet. There is a lot of lightning associated with the cloud, which is apparently striking the ground.
And it was all that was known at that point. For 7 weeks, the mountain had been building to this climactic eruption. On this day, she would do most of her work in the secrecy of her own created darkness. At Radio Lake Chelan, we dialed telephones furiously for hours. the U.S. Geological Survey, the Cowlitz and Skamania County Emergency Services Departments, special public information numbers, the State Emergency Services Department, the University of Washington, and others. And for a solid hour of dialing, the results were always the same.
5032. We're sorry. All circuits are busy now. Will you please try your call again later? This is a recording. 5032.
But at last, we got through to the State Department of Emergency Services.
What's happening there with the eruption of the mountain this morning? Have you folks got anything on it?
We certainly do.
What's going on?
We got, starting about an hour ago, we started having an event on the mountain that was starting with some explosion and tremor and some lightning flashes. We have an ash cloud that has risen to 50,000 feet. We've got confirmed reports of ashfall in White Pass, Mount Rainier, Pierce County. I've got a confirmed report from an individual in Randall that he's got 1/2 inch of ash. That's about 30 miles northeast of the mountain. We're in a flood watch situation along the Toutle River. We have people along that river system that are leaving, just in case. And other than that, we've got no confirmed reports of any type of lava or other releases of material.
There hasn't been any official warnings issued to leave any areas like the Toutle River?
Well, the high-risk areas, as I'm sure you're aware, have been off limits now for some time.
Right.
So we don't have anybody affected in those areas. We've got, like I say, a watch situation for floods in a radius 20 miles from the northwest corner of that mountain. We're particularly, as we understand it, most of the activity is happening in that corner. And like I say, most people are leaving even further away than that.
Can you tell me if there are observers that can see that big bulged area and will be able to see if it should give out?
Yes, we've got that covered by amateur radio personnel, and some of the scientific community have some stations.
Of course, much of that information, as it turned out, was wrong, but there was no way of knowing it at that time. It would be hours before we knew a slide had indeed occurred, unobserved by those scientific community stations. Those stations were destroyed, and what amateur radio observers could see was the ash curtain the mountain had drawn down around itself, not the mountain. It also would be hours before we knew that scores of people had violated that restricted area and paid the price of death for the violation. The world was in effect blind when it came to seeing the activity on Mount St. Helens. We would simply have to wait for her to decide to let us glimpse the havoc she was making. And anyway, the story was beginning to grow now, in the form of tons of ash drifting across the mountain and into eastern Washington. The story expanded to cover hundreds and then thousands of square miles. Radio Lake Chelan's Jerry Isenhart was monitoring conversations among ham radio operators. Their channels were very busy.
So you had a number of motoring public just traveling the roads of the state this morning on a morning that had a tremendous news event here in our area. These people are calling in from all kinds of locations, basically describing themselves as 20 miles out of Yakima or 30 miles out of Yakima. But basically what they're saying is this large cloud, which came from Mount St. Helens, has been blowing up and in a northeasterly direction and is now over the city of Yakima. One of the gentlemen that was somewhere between Portland and Yakima described the situation where he was at as a very dark morning. He said that visibility was to the place he felt like perhaps it might be wise to turn his headlights on. He said it was like driving in a sandstorm. Another gentleman on the road somewhere in that same area indicated that the temperature had gone down significantly.
And still the lines of communication to any officials near the mountain were impossibly clogged. By 10:10 a.m., we could offer only this summary of the morning's events. The official word out of the Mount St. Helens area is still very sketchy. Quite obviously, members of the U.S. Geological Survey who normally provide us with information are pretty busy right now observing that major eruption. But to recap for you what we do have officially is that shortly before 9 this morning there was a major explosion and eruption of Mount St. Helens. The eruption does not at this point include lava. At least it cannot be confirmed at this point than it does. There was one other unconfirmed report that it has lava flow. We can tell you, though, that the item of major concern, one item of major concern, which was the bulge area on the northwest side of that mountain, is still intact and has not slid. There were fears that that could go, the whole area could go down the mountainside in excess of 100 miles per hour, fill Spirit Lake, and cause catastrophic damage on down the Toutle River. But so far that has not happened. We do know that there was a major eruption. that the ash cloud is at least 50,000 feet into the air. And as Jerry has told us, the ham radio operators from throughout the state are confirming now that ash cloud is spreading very, very, very rapidly. We have confirmed reports of a half an inch or more of ash as far away as 50 and 60 miles. Ashfall at Mount Rainier, ashfall in Port Angeles. And so a very major eruption is occurring. At this point, there are no lives endangered. The red zone was totally empty. You might recall that yesterday there were people who said they were, as they put it, ticked off, that they weren't allowed to go to their homes. And yesterday, for a very brief period of time, they were allowed to go in to pick up their belongings and leave again. They were out before the morning came and the explosion came on Mount St. Helens. Of course, even at the time of that report, we did know that Harry Truman had stayed at his lodge near Spirit Lake. But at that time, there was still some hope for him, as it was not yet known that the tremendous blast had occurred, and that it was as big as it was, or that his lodge was totally buried. Shortly after that report, we were able to get through to the Cowlitz County Emergency Services Department, and we were finding that official volcano watchers had as little information as we.
I haven't been able to figure it out. I can't get off this phone long enough to find out what's going on.
Is that right?
Now we have a report of a major eruption, whatever that means. There are no people close enough to be directly affected, but the flooding on the Toutle River has begun. I have not got any details as to how bad it is.
But away from the mountain, there was information. The possibility of major problems from a vast cloud of ash got little or no attention before the eruption occurred. By mid-morning, it was getting more and more attention as the mountain seemed to be reaching out to make its presence and power known over an ever broader area. A spokesman for the Washington State Patrol gave us what was beginning to sound like ominous news.
Visibility in the remainder of the Yakima County is very limited at this time. It says it's completely dark in Yakima at this time.
It's gone dark in Yakima.
Yeah.
Wow.
It says all closures are due to poor visibility due to heavy ashfall from Mount St. Helens.
Now, the tiny community of Cougar, Washington, was very fortunate. It's located only 10 miles down the south slope of Mount St. Helens. If there was a safe spot on the mountain on that day, Cougar was it. And for the 7 weeks prior to this day's events, we at KOZI had been paying periodic telephone visits to Linda, Lois, and Dot Elmeyer, who operate a small grocery store called simply the Cougar Store. Through ominous warnings, shimmering earthquakes, and rumbling harmonic tremors, the ladies had remained unflappable. At about 10:30 a.m., we were finally able to reach and interview our very first eyewitness, the still unflappable Linda Elmeyer.
Hello, Cougar Store.
Hi, this is Scott Brundage calling at KOZI Radio in Chelan. Things kind of exciting down there today.
Oh, I'll say.
What were you at the store when the whole thing came apart?
Yes, I was.
What happened? What did it feel like?
Well, we had a pretty heavy earth tremor, heavier than normal, and that was the first indication, but I didn't really realize it. Just hang on a second.
Sure.
Okay, I got a customer. Okay. Here I am, back again. Sorry.
Business as usual today, huh?
Oh, gosh, business is busier than usual today.
Is that right?
Yeah, lots of film, lots of gas. People are nervous.
People are coming in to gas up in case they have to leave or
Yes,
something.
that's true. Right now, there's no firm plans about this. But I guess people are, want to be safe.
Well, when you felt the earth tremor, you didn't connect it right away with the mountain. Huh?
No, well, I knew it was the mountain, but I mean, we've been through so many of them that I wasn't going to get upset about that one, even though it was a little bit stronger. My first indication that the mountain was going was when a customer came in and asked for film, and he said Mount St. Helens is doing her thing, and I ducked down and looked out the window, and there was a big cloud. And in the short time it took me to wait on him and get outside, there was an enormous ash cloud billowing up, just mushrooming over and over, and lightning flashes through the whole thing. It was spectacular.
How about the explosions? Could you hear
that? We did not hear. We did not hear any explosions. They said they heard something to the north, but we never did, ever.
Very strange because the explosion was heard here, and we're a couple hundred miles away.
Yeah, and we heard nothing.
How about ashfall? Do you have a lot of falling ash now?
Pardon? I couldn't hear you.
How about ashfall? Do you have a lot of ash falling in Cougar?
No, none. None at all. No. The ash seems to be carried north. It's 8, 9, 10, and 20. It took a nickel walking cookies. Here. Yeah. And then it went. I'm talking to a guy here, and he said there was some tree planters within a mile of the base, and they heard nothing. Nothing. There was just a tremor, and off she went.
Well, what does it look like now?
It is tremendous. There must be a cloud, 20,000 feet or more into the air.
Yeah, they say it's 50,000.
Well, I wouldn't doubt it. I wouldn't doubt it. It is climbing up higher every minute, and it just keeps, mushrooming. There is no more lightning. That was only during the first part of it. But, it was something.
And by the way, when the next eruption came on May 25th and officials advised all Cougar residents to evacuate, well, we assumed the Cougar ladies had gone too. For over a week, we called on a daily basis and got no answer. Eventually, though, we did. It was Linda again. Oh, we never left, she said, but most of our customers did, and we didn't hear the phone unless we're out here waiting on someone. The ladies remained unflappable and immovable. But back to the 18th of May. By 11 a.m., the significance of the explosion was slowly becoming more clear. There was finally word that an earthquake accompanied the explosion. It was time for us to pull our fragments of information together and air a summary. But as you'll hear, important, even ominous-sounding news began to come in faster than we could summarize it. At KOZI Isenhart, it's 15 minutes now past 11 o'clock. And Mount St. Helens, as you've probably heard by now, had a major eruption this morning, which is continuing. The mountain at about 8:33 this morning began to spew huge amounts of steam and ash. Shortly thereafter, there were explosions heard in many areas of the state, but ironically enough, not always near the mountain. In Cougar, Washington, for instance, a report there from a couple of Cougar residents is that they heard no explosion at all. They did feel a very significant earthquake. So far, officials have only said that there was a large earthquake that occurred as a result of, or at least corresponding to that explosion. We don't have a reading of it yet on the Richter scale, but there were tremors felt many hundreds of miles away, including here in the Lake Chelan Valley. No lava eruption is occurring as yet on Mount St. Helens, but there is eruption again of steam and ash well in excess of 50,000 feet into the air. There are numerous road closures in the area. Generally speaking, roads which would take you to Mount St. Helens are being closed off so that folks can't flock into the area. They are leaving those roadways open, though, for people to come out of the Mount St. Helens area. There has been no major slide activity confirmed, although there are reports of boulders coming down the mountain and that kind of thing, and there are reports of flooding in the Toutle River, but that massive major slide that had been feared has so far at least not yet occurred. Officials tell us that they are watching that bulge area on the northwestern side of the mountain, and they'll watch it very carefully, of course, but so far at least it seems to be intact. And Radio Lake Chelan's Jerry Isenhart has been monitoring radio traffic throughout much of the area. And Jerry, what do you have for us?
Scott, a little background for the listeners that may not have heard an earlier report. Two things that may not seem related but turn out to be. Amateur radio people have been working in cooperation with other official agencies in that area over the past several weeks in doing some monitoring of some of the activity in that area. So there was some natural amateur radio traffic set up to handle some of the news that might come out of the area in case there would be such a thing as occurred today. Secondly, another element of the amateur radio community was having a convention in Yakima today, and you had numerous amateur radio people traveling into the Yakima area this morning on the roadways coming from the Seattle and Portland and all over the state coming into Yakima. We happened to be able to monitor their traffic as they were coming into the area, and were able to learn a great deal of information, although you can't exactly say that it's absolutely factual. Let me tell you some of the things we have learned just listening to a fellow...
Jared, just let me interrupt you there for just a moment, Jared. We have this is just into us. A dispatcher for the Cowlitz County Sheriff's Department says, quote, "The whole north face of the mountain has fallen. The Tootle area is being evacuated, and many areas have been evacuated. They're all going to higher ground," end quote. Again, now that is a radio dispatcher for the Cowlitz County Sheriff's Department, who's told United Press International that apparently that slide that was feared might have occurred. He said, and we're quoting, "The whole north face of the mountain has fallen. The Tootle area is being evacuated."
That is true. We'd heard that information as well. As far as the sonic booms or the loud booms that we heard here in this area earlier this morning, we mentioned we'd heard them here. They'd heard them in the Lake Wenatchee area. We felt the Forest Service had thought they were perhaps dynamite explosions somewhere in the area, and we're investigating that. Basically, we well confirmed, however, that the two booms that you heard, one shortly before 9 and the other right around 9 o'clock, were indeed from the Mount St. Helens area. They were heard, by the way, as far away as southern British Columbia. Out of the immediate Mount St. Helens area, though, the effect has been quite serious. The Yakima area, as you mentioned earlier, has been covered by a cloud that we're told what is at least 15,000 feet high of volcanic ash, and it was like snowing, only black snow, as one gentleman described it. They had up to 6 inches of volcanic ash laying on the ground in the White Pass area, we were told. 2 inches or so, at least in some portions of the Yakima area. Motorists were driving with their headlights on. We were listening to one fellow who was driving, trying to leave the area. He said, "I'm leaving. It's getting hard to breathe." I'm sure that would be true.
We attempted to confirm the fact that the whole north face had fallen in. We finally reached a spokesman for the U.S. Geological Survey and asked if he could make that confirmation.
Well, I really don't know at this point.
Apparently
there has been quite a bit of material blown off the cone, but we can't tell you really at this point how much it is.
Do you still have observers watching that bulge area?
The what?
That area that had been bulging. Do you still have observers who can watch it, who can see it?
Well, not at this point. Part of the problem, you see, is the ash is so thick that we on that side of the mountain, it's coming off on the north side and so forth, and then going east, is that they have not been able to get very good views of the north side of the mountain. So they don't, and that's where apparently most of the action is occurring, and they just can't see it very well.
Okay, if the speculation had been about a 100 mile per hour massive slide down the mountainside, if that had occurred, would you know about it, do you think?
Probably, yeah.
Okay.
If it had come out far enough from the mountain. Yeah, that speculation is a sort of worst case type of, hazard.
It was nearly noon, nearly 3.5 hours since the explosion, a photographer later likened to the Armageddon. And so far, to those of us at Lake Chelan, Washington, the story was still taking place somewhere else. It was an event of curiosity, and most had not yet considered that we might be affected. But after we aired this report from Jim Holcomb of the National Weather Service, listener calls to the radio station became much more frequent, and they showed a good deal more concern than curiosity.
Ash and other volcanic debris from a major eruption of Mount St. Helens is currently moving in an east-northeast direction and covering an area from near Pasco on the south to just south of Wenatchee and to Ephrata on the north. Satellite pictures indicate that the top of this ash and debris is moving at about 60 miles per hour. Columbia Basin stations are now reporting lowering visibility as the plume extends eastward. Yakima Airport has a visibility of 1/2 mile in volcanic dust and is also observing thunderstorms that are being triggered by the eruption. It is quite likely that the ash fall will increase over the Wenatchee area and the Columbia Basin and northward at least to the Chelan area and possibly to the Omak area during the next 12 to 24 hours if the eruption continues. Winds aloft from about 10,000 feet to over 40,000 feet were from the west to west-southwest direction this morning, but will tend to become more southwesterly during the next 24 hours. Mount St. Helens is about on a due southwest line from Wenatchee. The heaviest fallout of ash will be in areas closer to the mountain and under the main plume stream, with much lighter amounts at the periphery of the plume and as distance from the mountain increases. The southwest flow aloft is forecast to continue through Monday, so the north-central Washington and Columbia Basin areas will remain vulnerable to ash fallout as long as the major eruption continues.
It was coming then. or so it seemed, a gigantic load of ash, the same stuff that buried Pompeii when Vesuvius erupted in 79 A.D., coming not only to Chelan, but perhaps another few score miles into the Okanagan Valley. No one was ready to panic yet, but we were ready to ask some questions. We contacted Tony Bishop, a resident of the already darkened city of Yakima.
It looked like a thunderstorm. It looked like a really, a big thunderstorm. The sky was extremely black, and there was some lightning and thunder. And I got up. I was raised in Colorado, and I'm used to thunder.
At the time we interviewed geologist Warren Scott, we at Radio Lake Chelan had three basic objectives. One was to explore volcanoes in general. What are they? Why do they occur? Another was to attempt to find out how Mount St. Helens fits into the broader general picture. And the third was to get some idea of the scope, the magnitude of this volcano's furious hours on May 18th. Mount St. Helens sent its ash far. Its explosion was indeed big. But how far is far, and how big is big? So we talked about local landmarks like Earthquake Point, the Ribbon Cliffs, and Glacier Peak. The cities of Wenatchee and Chelan are only a few dozen miles apart, and these landmarks are only a few dozen miles at most from each city. This general area, then, is located in the very middle of the state of Washington, and far away is the mountain, in the southwest corner of the state, not dozens but hundreds of miles away. Yet the northern edge of that mountain's cloud of ash reached this area, and the eastern edge was far, far, far to the east of us. So we talked about this volcano and all volcanoes, about far and about big. To start at the beginning, why are there volcanoes in the first place?
We have volcanoes for this main reason. The Atlantic Ocean is expanding, the Arctic Ocean is expanding, and the Indian Ocean is expanding. I'm sure most people have seen where India has moved away from Africa and been rammed into Asia. Well, when you've got a sphere and some parts expand, you've got to have that slack taken up some other place. And so the Pacific is the part that is taking up the slack, which means that all around the Pacific, we are literally swallowing up the ocean, at least the ocean bottom. And so what happens here where we are, our mountains are mainly granite, which is lightweight. The basalt normally comes up into the ocean, which makes it fairly heavy. And so as we collide, the basalt tends to go down. We override it. This is why we have deep areas all around the Pacific. With the basalt going down, it takes the sediment that's accumulated on top with it. And this is where we get the explosive part of our volcanoes. You know, of course, any sediment is going to have water in it. But we also have calcite, which is the lime that you'd have in shells. We got gypsum and several other minerals that have what we call water crystallization.
Let me make sure I'm clear. When you say that the continental shelf is pushing the ocean plateau or shelf underneath it, right?
Yeah, you see, the basalt's heavier. Mm-hmm. It's just like when a boat comes up on a dock. The boat will ride up being lighter than the dock. Something of that kind of category.
And so some of the sediment that was under the ocean found its way into the fissures under volcanoes? And
yeah, in fact, actually, that sediment acts as a lubricator between the two plates. And it heats up for two reasons. One is the fact that when it moves down, you've got a lot of friction, and so that itself would heat it up. And then, of course, as it gets deeper and deeper into the earth is hotter, so it requires more heat there. And because we've got these relatively low-melting materials in it, that material then melts as it gets so deep. We get a great big reservoir, a bulb-like, of hot liquid material. And then it starts to melt its way up. Just like you'd have water melting its way up through ice, warm water coming up through ice.
Well, I've always had a mental picture, I guess, of a volcano being a tube through which material moves.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is it makes its tube as it goes. So
right. It melts its tube up. Now, since it starts, of course, it's under an awful lot of pressure, and this fact that we're moving against the Pacific plate makes it so we're putting pressure on, just like you put pressure on a bulb, on a balloon. And so, because, you know, to put something up takes a lot of energy. When you think about lifting up a cubic mile of stuff, you've got to have something down there pushing it. And so as it melts its way up near the surface, it usually will have a lot more pressure in it than is necessary just to lift it. And so when it gets up near the surface, it can lift a little bit, and some cracks go out. This is what makes the earthquakes that we record. Then when those cracks open up a little bit, the lava then goes out in it. In fact, we were just looking at ribbon cliffs today. You notice the horizontal sills in ribbon cliffs where the lava went sideways?
Mm-hmm.
That is the exact same thing is happening in St. Helens. The lava came in with a lot of pressure and simply lifted the rock up some. And this, you see, is the reason why the top of the mountain was moving up, was the fact that lava came in and was simply lifting the whole thing up. The harmonic motion that they talk about is the fact that when you have a lot of cracks that has lava in it, another crack occurs and it vibrates.
Oh, so it's the creation of a new crack that makes what they're
that
turning.
Makes the earthquake. And you see, being under pressure, it just tends to move on out. And along between here and Chelan, you've got a lot of white quartz material. Well, this is what would even proceed in the cracks even beyond the lava, because the lava being quite hot would tend to boil water out and steam. That would move out ahead, dissolve some of the rock, and of course when they got into a thin area where it cooled off quickly, well, you'd have the quartz and feldspar and other material forming again.
Now, one area I wanted to be sure to get into with you is this. We've had lots of conversations with people at the USGS in the past few weeks, and they've told us it was impossible to say for sure what this mountain was going to do, and we can't tell you what it's going to do now that it's done it. Mm-hmm. And yet, as I understand it, prior to the major eruption on the 18th of May, you had been of the opinion that there would be a major eruption. Is that right?
I could see no reason how it could keep erupting. When the south side of Spirit Lake raised a half an inch, I told my students, I said, if it raises an inch, we're in trouble. That means that there's more lava, more pressure in the lava than is just enough to make it erupt. And then when they discovered a 100-yard lift, I said, well, and then on top of that, with more and more severe earthquakes, which meant more cracks and more lava going into it, I just said I couldn't see any way how to keep it from erupting. And this thing, I said, well, if it goes for a longer and longer time, chances are it may blow up just like Krakatoa did in the 1880s. The whole top literally vaporized. Mm-hmm. That's how Crater Lake did. And I said, well, a moderate eruption would just mean that the north side would blow away. Here's the reason why I felt there would be an explosion. The water, which I was mentioning a minute ago, dissolved in the rock. As it comes up near the surface, the water dissolved into the rock, of course, is an explosive force for this reason. Every time you turn any quantity of water, liquid to steam, it takes up 1,800 times as much space. And you know, as myself, who used to work on a steam thrashing machine, that a small cylinder with just 100 pounds pressure do an awful lot of work. In fact, the old steamboats used to blow up, and their boilers didn't have very much pressure, just a few hundred pounds. But what we have here is a cubic foot of water. It may be up to 1,500 degrees or so. And the water's dissolved all through the rock. And it's just like when popcorn cracks. The whole thing explodes. The water turns from moisture to steam. In the case of popcorn, it just simply expands, which is incidentally the same way all our pumice forms. But in the case of the mountains like St. Helens, that lava is always explosive. That is, it has lots more water in it than most others. And so you can expect an explosion, at least on the first eruptions. And so I was not surprised at all when I was out here in my garden and heard that sonic boom and my rod shook. I said to my wife, well, there went St. Helens. And in fact, one of my students had asked me if I wanted to fly down there that day, and I said, no way do I want to be in the air when that thing goes. So I was not surprised at all, but my estimate was that it was a moderate explosion compared to what could have been. Now, if that had gone out toward Portland, it would have flattened it, because if you look at the maps, there's not very much to stop it between there and Portland.
You're talking about the blast
The
concussion.
big blast. Uh-huh. I was just reading here that Lassen did that when it erupted in the teens. Of course, they had a shock wave there came out. Martinique in 1902 in the Caribbean, it was different than ours this way. The big blast came out the side, and they were only 5 miles away, and it was hot as your hot plate. Rock and gas came down and simply roasted the people, boiled the ocean. But it didn't have a jet of lava go up as St. Helens did the other day. And so my first comment was, well, we didn't have a fireball go down the valleys toward Kelso or Portland, because I would bet you that the jet upward sucked all that back up. And you know, Jerry Pruss, on the back of the special edition in the paper, he said that they were on Adams, and he said that's what happened. He said that all that stuff that came out on the side was sucked back up and went right straight up. And so they were protected because of that.
Now, you mentioned a jet of lava. You're talking about a jet of lava inside the mountain.
No, I'm talking about a jet of steam, which carries the ash and pumice with it.
Okay.
And in this case, it blew the top off the mountain along with it. Now, what we got here, I took some of the ash and looked at it under the microscope, and it was literally blown up rock, probably from the top that blew out.
Mm-hmm. That fine dust, it blows up that fine. That's amazing.
Yeah, well, Brush said that there on Adams was 40 miles away. They were getting rocks hailing down on them, pea-size or so, and sticks.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you saw that picture with all the trees knocked over, there wasn't a little limb there. They were knocked off at least a foot or so thick. Apparently, every bit of the brush was picked up in the air and taken with it.
Well, you correctly forecast then that there would be an eruption of Mount St. Helens once. What do you think now?
Well, looking at it, I think what the case is this. There was some kind of a restriction way down low that allowed only so much lava to come through. The first little eruption, some of it made to the surface, leave some thin cracks that restricted the flow, so not very much got up there. As soon as it would get exposed, the dissolved water would cause it to explode, steam and ice would come out, and then as soon as it went down a ways to wherever the restriction was, well, that would be it. And then more would come in, and then go again. And what happened here, of course, that wasn't letting off very much. You remember it quit for a little while?
Yes.
And so the lava then was directed underneath this area that was lifting. And as soon as one little part of it lifted up, some of the dissolved water simply turned to steam, and that was a chain reaction, and everything in that area blew up. That was a big explosion. That was then followed by the lava that was down in the hole below, so it all turned to gas. Just like you burn almost anything. In other words, as it would come up a little bit, it would simply explode, and the lava that the water was in, of course, just expanded, broken up, and shot up with it. So it was just like a great big jet.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when that dissipated down far enough, then it quit. I would say the most dangerous thing we could have now would be if just a lot of steam and no ash came. That would mean that the lava was boiling off the water, and that would tend to freeze it. Because every gram of water that comes off has to take out 540 calories just to change to steam. That would tend to cool the lava and might freeze a plug. That way, then, it might allow the lava to go out somewhere else or build up and blow again.
I see.
So our safest thing would be if it went every week until it finally would stop.
Mm-hmm.
See, as long as we have earthquakes continuing, we know we got pressure down there yet. If earthquakes quit, I would say it's about all over.
Okay.
So we don't know how much stuff we've got down there that's going to come out.
You know, there's a lot of talk about lava, obviously, and
yeah, there's lava about 4 miles down there, 4 miles, and it's what we call an andesite lava. It's that brown lava there at Ribbon Cliffs, and it doesn't have much gas in it. It's a little bit of a salt, which covers the whole basin. It has hardly any gas at all, and it would be the last thing to come out. The lava that's coming out right now is rhyolite. That's the light-colored lava that you see all around Chelan. A little rusty, kind of buff-colored.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, between here and Wenatchee and Chelan, you see these dikes that are buff-colored streaks going up the side of the hills.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now that is where lava was coming up, and prior to eruptions, cracks would form out to the side, and the lava would run into it. In other words, we're slicing off the spider web type of thing of old volcanoes.
I see.
You know, you've got 3 or 4 on the top of Birch Mountain. And I don't know where around Chelan there's some, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's some where there were volcanoes.
Now, in terms of the
40 million years ago.
In terms of the origin of the molten mass, where does the heat come from that melts these rocks and makes lava of them, whatever?
A good bit of it is friction. You know, just the rubbing of one plate against the other. Mm-hmm. And, of course, when you get down many miles in the earth, it gets hotter. It gets to the point where it'll melt. You know, you go down 2 miles in South Africa, it's 130 degrees or so. So the deeper you go, the hotter it gets.
So, but the concept of a volcano being the top of a crack that runs down into the very hot molten core of the earth is not accurate.
No, it's just a limited little bulb. And you see, in fact, we're moving against the Pacific all the time. It fills up a little all the time. All of our volcanoes are going to go again. It just waits till it fills up, and then it works its way up again. So if we lived long enough, we'd see them all go. I guess we might say we're lucky we don't live that long.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it seems to me that one is enough.
Yeah. In fact, I just ran onto some research on some pollen in Idaho or in Montana and WSU lakes. They found that Glacier Peak had 2 eruptions a year apart, about equal amount. They found pollen in between the 2 layers, which told them that they had one year cycle of pollen.
Well, has it not been fairly recently discovered that Glacier Peak is not a dead volcano? Hadn't it been assumed for a long time it was dead?
It's just dormant. In fact, I think somebody has done some research and found that there were eruptions not too many hundred years ago. It's just that they haven't done an awful lot of research on it.
What I saw was somebody doing a thesis and said 200 years ago would have been the last eruption there.
Yeah. It seemed like I heard 600 too as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't think they even have any testing estimates on it. At least not very much. Of course, it's the one we should be real concerned about.
Yes.
Everybody around Chelan sees the ash that fell there 12,000 years ago.
That's another question that has been asked to me a lot, and I've heard from different people who say they've read this or that we have in the Wenatchee, Chelan areas that we have lava or ash or combination thereof from just about every volcano in the Pacific Northwest. Is that right? Or
when you go right out there by that fiber plant, right under Omi Gardens there, you see some white material there, and that is Crater Lake. Just looking at today, I think what happened there, there's probably a real strong wind, and it just kind of eddied behind that cliff, because most places you don't find hardly any of it. It just happened to be that it was concentrated and trapped there. Now, some WSU boys have taken checks of that, and they traced, what's in it, and also they've identified that for sure.
Mm-hmm. Have we seen ash from Mount St. Helens or in this area, or Mount Adams, or
I'm not real sure. I know that there were some people doing some checking and trying to trace them back. You see, that ash usually washes off, which is not very much. You see, there won't be much showing from what fell around Wenatchee.
Mm-hmm.
And, in future times, because it washed off, it incorporates in the soil. They just happen to find some spot where it settled and concentrated, then you can identify.
Let's change the subject just a little bit from what role how much of the Cascade Mountain range is there because of volcanic type activity? Is it a volcanic range of mountains, or are there some that are and some that aren't?
It's splattered here and there. Like we've got these dikes in here in Chelan, in Wenatchee and Chelan. Over by Lake Ketchlis, there's gray lava in there. It's here and there. It's a contributor, but granite rocks, like we've got around Chelan, are the main.
Okay. So we can't really say that it's a range of mountains created by volcanoes.
No.
What did create the range of mountains?
Well, it's mainly that in pressing it against the Pacific, it's kind of warped up. It's kind of wrinkled up. Mm-hmm. In fact, you see, we've had the same kind of movements here as we've got in San Andreas Fault, California. Chelan, Indiat, Wenatchee, all of those go diagonally northwest. And so we've had a kind of a northwest movement plus squeezing together and lifting it up. Kind of a pressure against it tends to make it move up. Like Mission Ridge, it's warped up.
Basically, we've squeezed these mountains out of the ground then.
Yeah. Of course, they're wearing away. Eventually, they'll be flat.
I have heard at various times that the Cascade Range is still a growing mountain range.
There are some places that it is going up. Right here in Wenatchee, I think it's almost stable. You've got some other places that are sinking. This is like 3 millimeters in 100 years or something. You see, we aren't moving very much. That's the reason we don't have a lot of earthquakes here.
Wouldn't it be fun if suspended animation were possible to look ahead a million years and see what those mountains that and pieces of earth that you spent years studying would look like then?
Yeah. Of course, when you look around here, it looks about the same 2,000 years ago, except what we've done to it.
Yeah. Do you have any desire to go see Mount St. Helens now?
No. Because I will go over it when I'm pretty sure it's quit. I just don't have any desire to be airborne when it blows.
May 18th, 1980. Mount St. Helens changed from a snow-capped peak to the mountain that roared with such ferocity that one man who later walked its slopes said, "If you can think in terms of the Armageddon." Will it do so again? Well, the answer is known, it is definite, and it is yes.